Nice. Fabulous.
Great. Hello, everybody.
Okay, so get started. Welcome everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Alex Jason. I am the chair of the Skirball Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies, which is one of the co-hosts of today's lecture with Professor David Koffman from York University. I just want to provide a general greeting and welcome you all here. As usual, it's a pleasure to see everybody, and I use the word see. I guess I'm going to drop the usual kind of scare quotes around see, because it is indeed a pleasure to see everybody. Those of you who have your videos turned on, to see everybody's faces and to hear from some of you, and it really is a pleasure also to welcome David to NYU virtually. This was, of course, supposed to be an in-person event today, but we are delighted that David has been able to join us virtually. I want to note also at the outset that as we originally conceived of this event, it was intended to be, and still is indeed, a co-hosted event between the Goldstein-Gorin Center for American Jewish History, the Skirball Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies, and the Native Studies Forum at NYU. And I'm delighted to introduce Professor Elizabeth Ellis, who's a professor of history at NYU and the director of the Native Studies Forum, to provide another introduction and to talk a little bit about how this fits into the context of the Native Studies Forum at NYU.
Unmute yourself.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Hebrew and Judaic Studies for collaborating with us and for organizing this really terrific event. Thanks to Hasi, and thank you as well, David, for joining us today. I'm really excited to do this event, in part because I think New York forms such a significant part of our cultural imagining and appreciation of Jewish life and culture. And it's really exciting to put this in conversation with the Indigenous community and Indigenous life in the city. So this feels like a really natural collaboration. I'm joining you. It's sort of interesting to do land acknowledgements in this digital era because we're all, of course, placed in perhaps physically different locations. I'm joining you from Lenape-Hoking, so from Lenape homelands in New York City. And New York City's actually got one of the largest contemporary American Indian populations in the United States, with more than 100,000 people who are American Indian living in the city, in addition to really substantive indigenous migrant populations. But Lenape people whose homelands we're on are in diaspora, and many of them, while they regard this as the center of one of the centers of Lenape homelands, are spread as far as Wisconsin, Oklahoma, Canada, and some of them are here in the city as well as in New Jersey. So as we think, and I'm looking forward to this talk about solidarities and intersections and the overlaps of experiences, it strikes me that New York is a really great place to sort of center one of these conversations. And I hope that as you all think about where you are in the country, maybe this provides an opportunity to recognize the Indigenous territory that we're all seated on across the country. So thank you so much for joining us. This Native Studies Forum is really excited to host you here at NYU digitally.
Okay, thank you. First, Professor Ellis, for participating with us in this. I hope that in some ways this is the beginning of an era in the Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies where we broaden our perspective to think about the multiple intersections and interactions between our prime subjects, Jews, wherever they lived, and the multiple peoples with whom they came in contact, with whom, against whose experiences they measured their own, thought about their own histories and cultures, and that it helps us break out of what have been long a structure of silo within the field. So thank you so much for participating, and I welcome everybody who's here. And I have to say, I always enjoy welcoming speakers because once I've welcomed them, I get to sit back and listen and be a kind of member of an audience. But there are few people who would be more excited to introduce than David Koffman, who was my student here. And for those students who, I see some of the names here who are in my seminar this semester, we read David's book, The Jew's Indian. So now you have a a face to go with a book that we had a fantastic discussion around, which we had a fantastic discussion. So just very briefly, David is a cultural and social historian of Canadian and U.S. Jewish history, and he holds the Richard Shiff Chair for the Study of Canadian Jewry and is a professor in the Department of History at York University in Toronto. He is a very broad scholar with just a kind of range of interests, and who has kind of keen mind and is a spectacular writer. And I always enjoyed getting his papers because they were always scintillating. His book, The Jews, Indian Colonialism, Pluralism, and Belonging in America, came out in 2019, and it and we will certainly hear about it today. He also recently edited a fantastic and stimulating forum for the Journal of the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era on Anti-Semitism, which he cajoled me to participating in, and it was a real challenging enterprise. He's been involved with Canadian Jewish Studies and is the associate director and is the editor-in-chief of the journal Canadian Jewish Studies. So I'm going to turn it over to you, David. And again, thank you so much for being here, and thank everybody in the audience, or whatever we call people, the little squares, for taking this time to listen to what no doubt will be a really interesting talk.
Thank you so much, Asia. Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Elizabeth, as well for hosting the talk today. Thank you, Kristen, for making all the arrangements. To all of you, of course, for coming on to this Zoom channel. I would have really loved to have been there in person. I spent 10 wonderful years in New York, and I've been following the harrowing and heartbreaking stories coming out of the city with compassion. So I wish all of you and your loved ones well. We're all sheltering in place somewhere these days. It's a curious phrase that we've suddenly become accustomed to using, and one that I feel invites me to reflect on the ways that our habitual language, even brand new expressions like this, can naturalize our present experience of place, and perhaps, in this case, elides the long view political histories that our shelters depend on. So the place where I'm currently sheltered is on the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat and the Mississaugas of the Credit River First Nation, among others, territory that remains subject of what's called the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which was an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Iroquois Confederacy, and a consortium of Anishinaabe or Ojibwe peoples and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. So for those of you who are not in New York or Toronto right now, I hope you can take a moment, at least in your minds, to acknowledge that there's a long and complex and a very specific Indigenous history of the place where you're currently sheltered as well. For today, I've prepared a talk of about 35 minutes, so we should have lots of time for what I hope is a genuinely live and open-ended Q&A. I've spent over a decade now reading about the places where Jewish and Indigenous histories intersect, and I believe these intersections give rise to some broader conclusions about Jewish modernity as a whole. Now, I'm going to come back to these suggestions at the end of my talk, but I'd like to first begin with a brief poke around for the start of the story. Perhaps the Jewish Native American encounter began as soon as Jews first arrived in the so-called New World. It's true that Jews were drawn to what would become the US by the Atlantic colonial triangular trade route, and the success that led them to settle permanently here rode not just on the financing and supply network of their ethnic and filial connections around the port towns where their brethren and co-religionists lived and with whom they could secure credit, of course, but perhaps more fundamentally on the reliability of a global market for goods. Jewish merchant families entered into the historical drama of the Atlantic Triangle as part of a diasporic merchant minority community, helping circulate fur, gold, arms, seeds, tools, and of course, slave bodies between Europe, its colonies, and Africa. The Jews mostly focused on the fur, and it was through indigenous access to fur that Jews gained the foothold for a permanent settlement here. The Jewish merchants became intimately involved in the economic development, cultural transformation, and political fallout in between a host of nations that this lucrative business and melange of cultural contact inevitably entailed. Their interactions with Native Americans were a complex blend of financial, social, religious, and even sexual relations, about which we know rather little. Then again, the Jewish encounter with Native America might have actually begun before Jews' arrival here, with the spurious claim that the Indians of North and South America, or some portion of them, descended from the lost tribes of Israel or had some other connection to biblical history. The claim preceded the first immigrants by many decades. It was wildly popular, hotly debated, promoted, and discredited repeatedly for an incredible range of differing ends by colonial administrators, scholars, missionaries, eventually Mormons, and indeed some Jews well into the 19th century. Or perhaps the relationship between Jews and indigenous people began even earlier in the minds and methods of Spanish civil and religious administrators who, according to scholar Jonathan Boyarin, took what they had learned about managing Jewish difference in the Iberian Peninsula before, during, and after the Inquisition and applied it to the indigenous inhabitants they would soon encounter as missionaries and colonizers. The colonized of Europe, perhaps, forged the model into which administrators tried to squeeze Native Americans. But the story that I'd like to focus on today begins with the Jewish immigrants to the American West that began in the middle of the 1800s, first from German-speaking provinces and later from Poland, Romania, and the Pale of Settlement of the Russian Empire. My aim is simply to map the broad contours of the Jewish Native American encounter from the middle of the 19th to the middle of the 20th century. And along the way, I'll focus on two starkly contrasting individuals who neatly capture a specific change over time that I want to illustrate as I try to make sense of the changing postures that American Jews have taken towards Native people over that century and in due time up to the present. The Jewish men were generally drawn to the West for its commercial opportunities as peddlers or sutlers. These are men who followed infantry brigades to provision them with dry goods and food. These itinerant traders were brought into direct business contact with indigenous suppliers and producers, as well as coal miners, farmers, freemen, and boomtowners, women and men. When they accumulated enough capital, they generally established larger general merchandising businesses and consolidated larger zones of trade, typically moving to an urban center where they could participate in Jewish communal life and settle down with families. Peddling was a kind of starter job in a startup world. The genesis of Jewish business success in small towns throughout the country should be located, at least in part, in indigenous business relations. In the many Wests of out West, Jews enjoyed most of the privileges of whiteness and took advantage of the benefits of American liberalism: motility unencumbered by the state, the absence of government interference into their religious practices and businesses, and emerging state laws that aim to protect their well-being and property and to secure a future for them there as individual citizens. As a whole, as you well know, Native Americans were not granted citizenship rights until 1924, the very year that Congress shut the immigration gates to Jews. Jews, in other words, were simply part of the broad culture of settlement or settler colonialism. They tended to see Native Americans in one of two ways. Firstly, as impediments to their commercial and settler aspirations. Violence and the threat of it were real, given the broad fight over the land and its resources, the creation and mobilization of a large military presence, of immigration policy, and of treaty making, all aimed to make lands west of the Mississippi available to European and already American settlers. Jews were at times violent. They applauded violence or justified it. They sometimes participated in vigilante violence, to which the state and law most often turned a blind eye. Jews produced myths of Indians as bloodthirsty, savage, and all the rest, some of which they learned from the popular press or from novels, plays, and the like in English, as well as ones in German and Yiddish that they sometimes even consumed before migration, or from letters received by the yet to migrate from those cousins and siblings who had already arrived. When Jews weren't seeing Native Americans as impediments, they saw them as vehicles to achieve their aspirations for social mobility and for economic mobility, rather, and for social belonging. On a practical level, Native Americans were Jews' customers and business partners. Native America also provided Jews out west with some of the metaphysical fodder they used to produce a sense of becoming American through celebrating their connections to Native Americans with special honorifics, by telling stories about being taken captive or being adopted or going native, and in commemorating their immigrant ancestors as pioneers or as Indian friends and teachers. The life of Otto Mears and the literature of remembrance about him is one of many potential examples it could have chose from about the ways that Jews utilized Native Americans to achieve their twin ambitions of mobility and belonging. It's a story about both his actions and the ways that they were subsequently memorialized. And it reveals some of the ways that Jewish integration in the West was directly wrapped up in the lives and fates of Native Americans. Mears emigrated from Latvian Kurland in 1852. He moved through Germany to New York and soon found his way to the frontier in search of opportunity. At age 19 in 1861, he joined Company H of the 1st Regiment of California Volunteers. Like other Jews who enlisted, Mears saw gaining military experience as a noble route to legitimation as a new American. For 3 years during the Civil War, Mears served under Kit Carson in his campaign against the Navajo in New Mexico. After he was discharged, he worked as a clerk for a series of German Jewish merchant firms there in New Mexico and in Arizona. He opened up his own trading post in Conejos, Colorado, and parlayed success upon success as a merchandiser, farm and land speculator, road and eventually railway builder and developer. Like other German-speaking Jewish immigrants to the frontier West, Mears was not a lone actor, but a man networked by religious, linguistic, and filial connections. The state of Colorado hired him as an interpreter in 1873 to work on failing negotiations between Ouray, the chief of the Ute, and Felix Bruneau, the chairman of the Board of Indian Commissioners, in its effort to secure contiguous counties of Ute land. The land grab, like many of the time, was justified in the language of productivity, since linking together newly acquired tracts of land was key for commercial development. One local newspaper of the day opined that these lands were currently only a broad, beautiful expanse of meadowland over which the Utes hold unquestioned control. But these favorite grounds of the Utes would, if occupied by us whites, become one of the richest and most productive grain and fruit growing countries in the West. A member of the state legislature argued similarly that all of the Ute territory bring no revenue to the government. On the contrary, the natives are supported at great expense. The same land thrown open to settlement would support many rich and prosperous communities that would return to the national government. Of course, the struggle over land was fierce and two-sided. A new round of hostilities erupted in the fall of 1879 when Utes at the White River Agency killed Nathan Meeker and 8 Indian sub-agents, including, incidentally, at least one Jew, Carl Goldstein. Several settlers were taken into captivity. Mears intervened as a negotiator and secured the release of these captives. In the wake of what was later known as the Meeker Massacre, popular sentiment in Colorado supported the forced removal of the remaining Utes. It was rumored that Mears, quote, privately circulated among them, giving each $2 in silver to sign away land rights. For this, he was initially brought up on charges and was actually ordered to Washington to stand trial. He went and he was eventually exonerated and then reimbursed by the federal government for his layouts. Later, local history books championed the ways that, quote, Mears and his fellow pioneers had wrestled control away from the painted wards of Uncle Sam, who guard every acre with jealous eye. After the government took over control of the land, Mears helped find what they called suitable reservation lands for the Ute along the Green River at the present site of the Uinta Reservation in Utah, and helped build the infrastructure for a physical new Indian agency there, which he earned a great commission for, of course. He built private toll roads next through the Arkansas Valley to the San Juan, establishing mining interests and securing lucrative mail carrier contracts to supply settlers with tobacco, coffee, sugar, and other dry goods and foodstuffs, taxing the cargo of his competitors. He has started a newspaper 2 years later in 1872, Natsawatch, to promote the San Luis Valley for new settlers. And with his considerable resources by the mid-1870s, he began building the Rio Grande Southern, one of several Mears-owned railroads that linked up the resources of the Mountain West with markets on both coasts. Otto Mears was, in short, an active participant at various stages of the forced removal of distinct Native American nations, the dispossessions of their lands, their subsequent containment, and the commercialization of the newly acquired and sometimes untreated lands. His ascendance from orphaned immigrant to an Indian war soldier, from a settlement broker to a wealthy and eventually elected member of the Colorado legislature and a so-called founding father of the state of Colorado, rode on one of these key pieces of settler colonization. Celebrations of Mears' contributions, both as a businessman and as a so-called pacifier of Indians, would be frequently repeated in the popular press and in local history works long after his death. In particular, Jewish journalists and amateur historians of the Jewish Western experience in the last decades of the 19th century through at the 1930s at least, celebrated Mears' triumph over Indians and the acquisition of their land as a means of emphasizing Jewish belonging in both the physical geographic landscape as well as socially and affectively in the national Western spirit. Now, I hadn't sought them out when I scoured the Jewish archives for this project, but I found no shortage of glory stories like this, some of which were actually quite gory, stories that were meant to transmit messages by Jews for Jews about Jews, Jews who lynched, who shot and scalped Native Americans, and who were praised for acquiring Indian lands. They regularly circulated in local Jewish histories, in obituaries, personal letters, and memoirs in Alaska and Arizona, Missouri and Montana, Nebraska, Nevada, South Dakota, Texas, Oklahoma, and Wyoming. 2 generations of Jewish communal record keeping and local historical consciousness situated Jews at the center of what the cultural historian of the American frontier, Richard Slotkin, has called narratives of regeneration through violence. Now, stories about Jewish victimization from Indian cruelties, as they were called, also circulated. And these stories mirrored and reversed those stories of violent perpetration, but they resulted in similar sorts of conclusions, narrative plots, and civic lessons. They explained and justified the seizure of Native American land and the sacrifice that warranted and sanctified imperial victory, a certain kind of American libertarianism. In telling stories of both varieties, Jews identified as model national subjects who took up the charge of settling, civilizing, and Americanizing the land. Jews perpetrated violence and fell victim to it, not as Jews per se, but rather as part of the settler population. Yet Jews wrote about these participations as acts of Jewish sacrifice and Jewish brawn, as a way to strike against the myth that they lacked the muscular ruggedness to make them fit for the expansion enterprise. They wrote with a proud awareness of a reversal of their recent experience in Europe, where they had suffered as the colonized. These narratives of perpetration and victimhood earned Western Jews a sense of home among emerging nation of whites. They were acts to end exile, according to their storytellers. Now, as scholars of Indigenous history have shown in great detail, Displacement was devastating to Native American communities. It disrupted traditional knowledge and practice, changed food, economics, culture, and language, had a massive death, disease, and trauma toll. But while Native American communities tended to suffer geographic dislocation, political disorder, and cultural disruption in the West, Jews achieved stunning social mobility, religious latitude, relative economic security, and created scores of new communities. In the words of William Toll, a historian of Pacific Coast Jewry, for Jewish men, the merchant role in the West enabled them and their families in a single generation to move from medieval artisanship and itinerant merchandising to the highest civil status. Within a few short decades after the so-called closing of the frontier, the plot line of Jewish-Native American relations pivoted rather dramatically. With the violent contest for land largely over, enfranchised and mostly American-born Jews of the mid-20th century East Coast, here I'm talking about, or will talk about, lawyers, anthropologists, linguists, educators, journalists, even a few rabbis, expended considerable effort at what they called Indian uplift and promoted some of the most effective tools of progressive pro-Native ideology and policy that America ever created. To help characterize this very different sort of Jewish-Native American encounter, let me introduce you to a second figure, the lawyer, legislator, and advocate for Native rights, Felix Cohen. Born in 1907 in Yonkers, the son of the famed legal philosopher Morris Raphael Cohen, Felix was one of a significant number of Jews who devoted money, time, energy, political capital, and expertise to various efforts aimed at improving the lives of American Indians during the middle decades of the 20th century. His work offers a crystallization of an entire cadre of mid-century Jewish liberals, socialists, and progressive work and sensibilities as they helped to fashion the Roosevelt administration's Indian New Deal in the 1930s under the leadership of John Collier, who was the non-Jewish Commissioner of Indian Affairs in the Department of the Interior. These Jews worked at the top echelons of leadership, drafting and shaping Indian federal policy and law. They helped launch, fund, and staff some of the most important not-for-profit efforts at advancing Native Americans of the day, including the Association on American Indian Affairs, the Indian Rights Association, the National Congress of American Indians, the Indian Defense Association, and many more. They shared and were shaped by a common sociology of community organizing, of faith in the law as a vehicle for social change, and a Jewish sensibility inculcated by their communal attachments and socialization. They worked assiduously on Indian affairs even after the demise of the Indian New Deal, well into the conservative post-World War II reactionary period known in Native American historiography as termination. Mid-century American Jews, in short, were engaged in a rich and complex critique of the US imperialism and its past government's mistreatment of Native Americans, and its first ever serious attempt at redress using the tools of the state. Jews' effort both inside and outside government shows that Jews played an outsized role in establishing some of the key institutions, techniques, and organizations that Native American leaders would themselves use to expand their power and capacity later in the 20th century. Enfranchised Jews working in law firms and at the nation's capital, at not-for-profits, and in academic institutions were steadfast and utterly sincere in their wishes to improve the lives and communities of Native Americans around the country, just as they had fought for the rights and enrichment of many American minority groups, African Americans chief among them. For these liberal Jewish actors, advancing Native American was but one prong of the broader goal of advancing all groups whose rights and cultural self-determination they thought needed securing, and ensuring that individuals from any group would receive the same protection of the law to shape their own cultural, economic, and religious destinies. From his coming of age until his death at the age of 46, Felix Cohen's intellectual and political pursuits centered on Indian rights. His wife, Lucy Kramer Cohen, was an anthropologist trained by the Jewish godfathers of American anthropology, Franz Boas and Edward Sapir. she remained active and connected to the group of Boaz and Sapir's largely Jewish students who put the anti-racist, cultural relativist discipline of anthropology onto the map and into American universities by focusing by and large on Native American subjects, or perhaps objects is a better way to put it. Another fascinating meeting place of Jewish and Native American histories, but a topic for another time. Cohen's vision for Indian Renaissance was of a piece with the most progressive strand of non-Native ideas for Native Americans at the time. The Department of the Interior tapped a group of young lawyers, including Cohen, Nathan Argold, half a dozen other Jews, a few Gentiles, and a Mormon, and authorized them to begin working on major legislation to try to reverse the problems associated with the assimilationist policies that were in effect and had been since the Dawes General Allotment Act of 1877. Their brainchild, the Indian Reorganization Act, or the IRA, also known as the Wheeler-Howard Act, passed in 1934. It was the first federal Indian policy in more than 100 years that did not have the explicit purpose of undermining the status of Indian nations. On the contrary, the IRA aimed to fundamentally reformulate national Indian policy to set the government's goal as establishing Indian self-governance and provide Native American communities with sufficient authority and powers to represent reservation populations. It aimed to promote cultural pluralism and tribal sovereignty. Among its many provisions, the IRA ended the practice of dividing up reservation lands into small parcels and giving them to individual Indians to farm or to sell, and allowed Native Americans to voluntarily exchange allotments so that Native groups could consolidate land instead of living on checkerboarded reservations. It restored tribal ownership to the remaining surplus lands that had been created by the implementation of the allotment system, and it provided Indians with economic aid and appropriated annual funds for the acquisition of even more additional land for the landless. The IRA, interestingly, was law only for those tribes who opted in and who chose to be governed by it. Tribes had the right to exclude themselves from the provisions of the law altogether if they wished. The drafter didn't want the IRA to be one more wave of top-down legislation. Tribes that accepted the IRA could draft constitutions defining their powers of self-government and establishing business charters that permitted them to borrow money from a revolving credit fund. More than two-thirds of eligible tribes voted to accept the IRA. More than one-third wrote constitutions, some of which Felix Cohen himself helped to draft. And the IRA, perhaps most radically, authorized tribal councils established under the Act itself to negotiate with and to litigate against the federal, state, and local governments in what would soon be established as the Indian Claims Commission, or the ICC, a kind of parallel court for tribes to sue the government for damages. The Indian Reorganization Act was unusually liberal in that legislators created laws that rescinded governmental powers, not as an attempt to shrink government agencies for right-leaning ideological reasons, but in order to provide redress for its own failings, aware of the impacts that centuries of policy and law and war had made on Native Americans. The opportunities made available to tribes under this act were, in the assessment of Native American legal historians Vine Deloria Jr. and Clifford Little, immense. Cohen's accomplishments went still further. He assembled and redacted the Federal Handbook of American Indian Law in 1940, a compendium resource of all of the states and federal legal proceedings on matters of Indian law to date, a book that became known as the, quote, Bible for the American Indian Bar. After he left government service, he interpreted the IRA as an attorney hired by tribes to represent them in their legal batteries against the government at the Indian Claims Commission. He and many, many other Jewish litigators won tens of millions of dollars in awards for their client tribes. He wrote dozens of articles, editorials, and letters to editors of major American newspapers concerning contemporary legislative issues of import to Native Americans, ceaselessly observing misconceptions about Indigenous people and calling out settlers' unfair treatments of their communities. We have often disposed of them, he wrote, spiritually by denying their existence as a people, by taking refuge in the myth of the vanishing Indian, or by blaming our grandfathers for the wrongs we commit. In this way, we have often assured ourselves that our national sins are of purely antiquarian significance. They are not. Cohen saw Indian advocacy as inextricably linked with the work of defending all minorities, and Jews were very much on his radar as well. In fact, he coupled nearly all of his appeals for anti-discrimination law and public opinion about Jews with appeals on behalf of other American minorities. Like other Jews of his cohort, Cohen worked on Jewish immigration and minority recognition issues. He worked on American Jewish causes with the American Jewish Committee, among others, with France's Alliance Israélite Universelle, with British Jewry's Anglo-Jewish Association. He even penned one of the earliest memoranda on the prevention of discrimination and protection of minorities that was ever submitted to the United Nations claims on human rights. He was also explicit in his writings about why. He argued that Jewish and Native American traditions were at the root of the most elemental virtuous qualities of America itself. In one address he gave to graduating law students at Yale entitled "The Meaning of Americanism," Cohen claimed to elucidate the sources that he thought lay at the heart of America's noblest virtues, the twin influences of Judaism and Native American culture. On the one hand, he judged America's foundational ideal, what he called it, its core moral imperative, to be the Hebrew Bible's injunction to care for the stranger. This beckoning, according to Cohen, undergirded the best of the nation's attitude towards things like immigration, social welfare innovation, and its domestic public policy. It animated America's purpose. Yet, in order to operationalize this foundational ideal in political terms, it had to be combined with a second influence, which he called the nation's spirit of tolerance, something he located in the Iroquois or the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the indigenous political pact that had long enshrined the cooperation of 5 nations, the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, and later a 6th, Tuscarora Nation, the so-called people of the Longhouse. Admiring the skills that Native American leaders had at forming political confederations, he said, underwrote the experience and wisdom necessary for America's very system of government, its libertarian yet communalistic tolerance. Cohen, in other words, traced the 2 most fundamental ingredients for his vision of America's highest ideals to Jews on the one hand and Native Americans on the other. He paired his investments in Jewish and Indian issues throughout his career in practical terms too. His Indian advocacy began in the shadow of the Nazi rise to power in the mid-30s, right up to his death in 1953. Reflecting back on 2 decades of Jewish and Indian advocacy work just a couple months before his death, he gave further voice to the motivation that drove his own work, writing, "We have a vital concern with Indian self-government because the Native American is to America what the Jew was to the Russian czars and Hitler's Germany. For us, the Indian tribe is the miner's canary, and when it flutters and droops, we know that the poison gases of intolerance threaten all other minorities in our land." Yet Cohen's and his Jewish colleagues' advocacy efforts were circumscribed. These Jews lacked both intimate knowledge of and deep existential ties to Native Americans' experience and their visions for their own futures. The intellectual and political perspectives that mid-century Jews assumed to be good for all American minorities, quote, minorities, including an almost sacrosanct view of statist liberalism and an idealistic confidence in the tools of lobbying and policy making and law to effect change, these limited Jewish contributions to reshaping Native Americans' well-being and their communities' futures as they themselves might have wished it. Their work also betrayed something of an assimilationist impulse that American Jews seem to accept as a fundamental given of the American Jewish experience. On a basic level, they assumed that all so-called minorities shared a vision for a more inclusive nation. when these Jewish professionals grappled with the terrible impacts of colonialism on indigenous communities, they assumed that Native Americans were, in this sense, like other immigrant groups who saw themselves as minorities. They did not put forth a vision for decolonizing America in the language that we use today, did not speak about Native Americans as autonomous nations able to engage in something like nation-to-nation negotiations. They were far less vociferous about ensuring the full expression of Native Americans' political self-determination. Rather, they pursued a politics of justice through incorporation into the benefits and virtues of America. They grappled with the legacies of the colonization of Native Americans in ways that made sense to them as Jews and in ways that fit their commitment to liberalism and to accommodate to the framework of national pluralism. Still, Cohen campaigned for American Indian legal rights and recognition more intensely than any other American Jew, and more than a few non-natives had in all of American history, I think it's safe to say, and he did so with some measure of Jewish self-consciousness. His identification with Native American issues illustrated in a concentrated manner how mid-20th century American Jewish liberals tried to mediate between political insiders and minority outsiders, between powerlessness and power in American civil life. Occupying this kind of middle zone served several simultaneous functions. It allowed enfranchised Jews like Cohen and the lawyers, boosters, board members of a panoply of Indian rights organizations, still absorbed with the memory and recent historical experience of Jewish disempowerment, to feel both settled in America and Jewish by, quote, identifying down with Americans whose collective corporate fate had feared far worse than Jews' fate had in America. It also allowed Jews to enact their devotion to liberalism and foster the American institutions and values that they, as Jewish liberals, cared for, namely tolerance, equality, the rule of law, and the protection and preservation of minority rights. These outcomes, they believed, would secure the brightest future for America and all its minorities, Jews and Native Americans among them, because they had seen the ways that these principles of liberalism had served their immigrant families and communities. All right, so much for my two case studies. Now, to be sure, there are many other interesting theaters in which Jews and Native Americans met, imagined, and discussed one another, into which we might dive, that emerged at specific moments of the 20th or 21st century, about which there is little to no scholarship yet. The 19-teens, 20s, and 30s was home to an elaborate discussion about race, biology, and character, and during this time, Jewish scientists and civic leaders discussed the relative placement of Jews to American Indians in race thinking and eugenics. Much of their use of Indians during this time centered around immigration restriction, combating nativism and xenophobia. It was about who was fit to immigrant. There was and remains, of course, a tense debate about comparative genocide that began in the 1960s. There are many subsets of business and cultural encounters around casinos, the energy sector, and the world of art and cultural products. There's certainly what to say about Jewish and Native entanglements around spirituality, land-based religion, and environmentalism. And most recently, there's emerged a tense discourse about Israel-Palestine and the idea of indigeneity. So there's lots of other topics. But at this point, I want us to steer us towards some of the broad conclusions that I think can be drawn from the encounters that I've specifically focused on today, the Jews of the frontier West, who acted as agents of colonialism, seeing Indians as impediments to their immigrant aspirations for social inclusion and economic mobility, and the enfranchised Jews of the mid-20th century, the lawyers, social scientists, and others who expended considerable effort at Indian uplift and promoted some of the most effective tools of progressive pro-Native ideology and policy that America has known. Perhaps the biggest and thorniest implication that I think arises from the change over time that I've presented this aft is that rather than seeing the American Jewish experience only as an immigration story, it might be more accurate to see Jewish immigration history as part and parcel of the complexity of colonial history, really part of the global histories of displacement and the incredible geographic rearrangements that reshaped the lives and locations of so many millions in the last century and a half. We get something new when we see ethnic and religious communities' migration histories from the vantage point of those most dramatically impacted by mass modernity migration. And incidentally, this is not just an American story. We need to ask questions about these same sorts of processes with respect to Canada, Latin America, the Caribbean, Australia and New Zealand, and even pockets of Southern Africa. If there's a broad insight about Jewish history to take from my research, I think it's that there are real limits to the basic framework in which the field of modern Jewish history is generally cast. Emancipation, too centered in the Western European experience. In the so-called New Worlds, citizenship rights, of course, were never really up for debate and were never a problem. Yes, Jewish immigrants moved for them. They migrated for food and for security and for religious latitude as well. But the liberalism of the New World colonies worked, and the conditions for Jewish migration became possible because of global capital expansion, because of the resources that European empires captured. And so Jewish movement around the globe simply has to be seen in the context of what made it possible. The central insight that I think arises from attunement to the Jewish indigenous relationship might be that the American Jewish past is burdened because the history of the multinational mass migration that produced America is the history of colonialism, just as modernity is mass migration, modernity around the whole world with all of its politics of inhabitation. Immigration, even refugee immigration, is part of the colonial story. They're just flip sides of the same coin. American Jewish history ought to be seen then not just as the heroic story of immigrant ascent and accomplishment, but as part of the story of the juggernaut of modernity. The massive waves of migration that relocated millions of Jews from Europe and Asia to its peripheries and settler societies and colonial outposts over the course of the long 19th century was a transformation as profound as any major change in the history of the Jews. And it's into this context that I suggest American Jewish history ought to be understood. The story that I've told this aft likewise complicates the long romance of Jews and liberalism, because it shows quite acutely and perhaps a bit painfully that Jewish devotion to liberalism has included both its most noble and its most pernicious elements, or many promiscuous elements, sorry, not pernicious. Widening the frame of American Jewish history to include the uncomfortable fact of colonialism doesn't entirely undo the story that we know and tell about American Jewish life, of course, the immigrant success story, but it does complicate it. The fact that Jews were among the colonizers in a process that clearly harmed indigenous peoples and lives did not alter the need that Jews felt to emigrate from Europe and Russia. It doesn't alter the tribulations or the accomplishments of Jews once arrived here, but it does ask us to contend with this politics of this mass migration and to consider the consequences for Jews, indigenous people, and perhaps even some fundamental ideas of America itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David, for a stimulating talk. I know everybody's kind of clapping in their own quarters. There's also a Zoom reaction where you can do a clap hand if you prefer. We have there Hasia is doing. Many people are doing it now. This is a shadow of the usual acknowledgement we get in person. I want to open the floor for conversation, discussion. As a matter of procedure, the simplest way to do this is if you click on in your Zoom menu under the participants, it should bring up a box with all the names, and you have an opportunity to do a hand raising there in the box. And if you do that, a little blue hand will show up in your Zoom box, and David will then see there, or he or I can both identify you. You could also just raise your hand literally in your screen if that would be helpful as well, if you can't find the Zoom hand raising.
Alex, maybe I'll ask you to toggle back and forth between the two screens as well, since I probably only be able to see the hands.
Yes.
On this
yes,
one.
I have my full screen. One of the other things you can do is if you want to jump in, you can certainly post a question in the chat box, and then I will call attention to whoever it is that's posting the question in the chat box. believe it or not, all these different processes work to continue the conversation. So I'm going to open the floor right now. Okay, Hasya, your hand is raised. And you have to, unmute yourself as well. Sorry, one second.
I see how to do it. So
Yeah.
David, I have two questions, and one is somewhat of a more procedural type one, which is a number of the people whose faces you can or cannot see are graduate students. And thinking about the time frame that you have covered, you offered some ideas of new questions that could be asked, but what about within the time frame that you have asked? What kinds of projects could you see students pursuing to build upon your work? So that's sort of my first question. And the second is, how would you make a kind of, would you see a kind of parallelism or an arc between this story and that of Jews doing very similar things vis-a-vis African Americans, which is being involved in the slave trade, owning slaves, profiting from slavery as garment makers, therefore dependent on cotton production, and then doing this kind of liberal dances at the same time. So two very different questions.
Or the liberal dance afterwards, maybe right after. Okay, let me go with the first. Actually, I'll deal with the second first. Yeah, there are certainly parallels, and as you and probably lots of other people know, there's really quite a large bookshelf on the Jewish encounter with African America, and it's a variegated literature. There's debate in it. There are a lot of great focus studies, including microhistories in cities and rural ones, stuff about the North and about the South, material that deals with culture, that deals with the broad institutions of nonprofits and policy. So it's a really rich field that's been well developed. When I had the hunch that maybe this would be an interesting area of research, I was nervous whether I'd find enough material to write anything about, have enough material to support. Well, I don't think it's parallel in terms of scope. I think there are many interesting questions that could be elaborated upon. The difference is, I think there is obviously a pattern about kind of the basic social and economic forces that drove Jewish, kind of decision making and their success in America, and then a later turn to liberal politics and to cultural considerations that happens later in the 20th century and after Jews are more enfranchised, after they kind of get to accrue all of the benefits of their enfranchisement. But I think there are some important differences as well. First is that there are many fewer Jews who actually have interactions with Native Americans because they mostly involve encounters in interesting places, in rural parts, in small towns, on reservations. And since more Jews lived in big cities where they were just more likely to have encounters with other immigrant groups and with African Americans than they were just in terms of raw numbers with Native Americans. That was one. Two is that in a way they didn't really compete with one another. Jews and Native Americans didn't compete with one another in the same sectors as did many Jews and African Americans in cities for housing or for jobs. There was a kind of competition between Jews and Native Americans, but it was for the land and its resource. So it was kind of structured very differently. Yeah, I'd say those are kind of the three biggest ones: scope, place, and the kind of close quarters and the natures of their the forces that put them into interaction with one another. As for other projects, there's so many. I think they think there are projects that could be carved out for people interested in cultural history and intellectual history between, kind of ideas about, pluralism and who fits and how to even think about different kinds of sorts of people. There are incidentally projects that I think could be done from a Jewish studies kind of perspective, and I think other interesting projects that might be undertaken from a native studies perspective, something that I'm not really trained to do, but I think would be really interesting. In the earlier part of the story, the sort of mid-19th century part of the story, I think it would be a really great project to try to understand when and how specific different Native American groups developed language for understanding the different kinds of settler populations. There's like national origins or religions, were not organic categories for indigenous understandings of who people were. But at some point, or even the language of race for that matter, these kinds of categories had to have be incorporated into the indigenous category. So when and how this happened, I think would be pretty fascinating. And I think Jews would be a great test case for seeing how, again, specific nations in their own cultural context came to understand difference among settler populations. There are stories in different business sectors that I think would be great, and I think most of these could be done at a much more focused telephoto kind of way. The project that I started was very broad, and I went on a very wide fishing expedition for whatever sources that I could possibly find, frankly, without an intervention in mind. I didn't know what I would conclude about any of it. I just tried to gather as much as I could, and then tried to winnow it down and include elements in the book that I thought made sense together, and then develop an argument based on the sources. So now that some of that broad work's done, I think there could be much more focused local studies in any number of places that might challenge some of my conclusions. And again, find other areas in culture or economics or in, with regards to specific issues that were more germane to local moments.
Great, thank you. Other questions or thoughts? Again, you can, I see two participants raising their hand. Natalia, why don't you go ahead, and then I see
Hi. Thank you for the lecture. I was wondering about the language of encounter, because I've seen in the literature that Professor Diner mentioned, like Black-Jewish relations. And so how does changing, I guess, maybe from relations to encounter support your arguments, help it change it?
Yeah, that's a neat question. When I think about the relations term, I think about them in terms of kind of official, established, voices, or at least organizations that attempt to speak on behalf of communities and their encounters. And I felt like the term encounter would capture a much broader set of moments of interaction. And since so many of the kinds of moments that I've found in evidence of in the archive involve individuals and not Jewish organizations, they were patterned. There was enough of them that they clearly formed patterns that happened similarly in lots of different places, involve not just these two individuals, of course, that I focused on today, but many, many, many people. They seem like patterns worth recognizing. But I felt it was just a broader, more inclusive kind of category. It also allowed me to incorporate some things that didn't involve actual face-to-face engagements, but also ones that did. So as I worked through all of my material and asked, how does it or does it hang together, I felt like that was a good opening, good way of framing it.
Gennady, you have your hand up as well. Go ahead.
Hi, Gennady. Nice to see you too.
We have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I was saying that it's so good to see you after so many years. Yeah, I don't remember how many years, actually, but quite a few years. My question is, it's about Jewish farmers in the United States, in various places. So, and did you have a chance to see in your research any encounters between the Jewish farmers and Native Americans, friendly, not very friendly, or whatever, or really they were absolutely in different zones of settlement?
Great question. So they were definitely not in different zones of settlement. It was always very much the same land. in most of the cases that I looked at, I mean, I did go looking for some of them, and most of the lands that have been parceled out by the American federal government and actually by the Canadians as well in allotments in these 140 or 160 acre plots that were given to Jewish families to farm, were already secured by the state or by the RCMP, a decade to sometimes 3 decades before they were divvied up and given as plots for Jewish farmers to settle. That doesn't mean they weren't connected. Of course they were, but it didn't actually produce all that many face-to-face encounters, at least that I found. So there were, federal policies of clearing the plains, all kinds of sort of nasty service that went, that was organized by the state and by the military in order to make these lands available to farmers. And Jews were just one of the many European, stock that were beneficiaries of this process. I suspect that in some places where there were large indigenous populations, like in Manitoba, especially around Winnipeg, where there were a lot of Jewish farm colonies, there probably were more face-to-face encounters. I had a kind of cursory look for a bunch of these in Colorado and in the Canadian prairies, and didn't find many of the Jews reflecting on any kind of relationship with Native Americans or even discussing the kind of indigeneity of the land that they were farming on. But I suspect this is one of those areas, alluding to Asia's question, that if it was dug into further might yield some really interesting material.
Thank you.
Actually, I'll just add incidentally that the kind of organized Jewish community in the organizations that sent Jews to work as agriculturalists out of Galveston in Texas, and through the other projects through the Canadian West, that they were permits that were only given to Jews to come from Europe in order to farm, and many came without actually any farming experience. And so these colonies were largely a failure. They didn't last very long. But the organizations that promoted them, like the Baron de Hirsch Association and the Jewish Colonization Association, they were pretty explicit in some of their central headquarter missives and memos and documents that describe the planning of these initiatives to put Jews on the land as speaking to some of the kind of basic clearing the land of Native people for European settlement, and how this was something that would advance the cause of the nation and was done in the name of making the land and the people productive. So there was some kind of entanglement there at the rhetorical levels from the people who paid for and organized the Jews in this respect.
Great. Looks like Josh has his hand up.
Yeah, thanks for a really rich and thought-provoking paper. So let me preface this with, this is a question purely out of ignorance. I am but an ancient historian, if anything. But my question pertains to some of the analytical frameworks that you're working with, particularly the language of settler colonialism. So I'm just curious as to its function vis-a-vis the colonialism that most people usually think of. So can you talk a bit about the maintenance of like the noun there with just the adjective? And then on the flip side, like at what point would a new term be instructive? Like when is wine no longer great beer or something like that?
Well, that's a good question. It's a very politically charged question. So there are scholars of colonialism, and they basically understand that there are many different sorts of colonial enterprises. And for the for the enterprises that involve, building new colonies in a place and having permanent settlement there, the word settler is amended or appended to the term colonialism. Most of the scholarship, I think, sees this as just a basic descriptive thing, and I try to use it as a descriptor as well. I know that it's like one of the C words. It's like it's a bad word in lots of political circles, or it's a good word. It's a politically charged word. I just couldn't think of any other kind of basic category. to use other than it. As for when a different term might arise, I mean, that's up to whoever tries to use one and argue effectively that it's has better utility. But so far as I could tell, this one has the most utility, even if it carries some tense baggage about its politics. As I say, I didn't, you know, like I didn't read histories of colonialism for my comps. It wasn't an area that I trained in. I didn't take a single graduate course at my beloved NYU in history of colonialism, only because I didn't really know that I was going to need it. I came at the subject as a student of modern Jewish history, or specifically of American Jewish history, and I kind of tried to back into the literature as best I could. So it's possible that scholars and theorists that are, you know, more wrapped up in the, you know, parsing out the meanings of these terms and their politics, like, may have something to say, even critique about how I deploy these terms, and I would certainly welcome it. But I was honestly just kind of muddling with them and thought that this was the cleanest way that I could articulate the broad points that I wanted to make.
Thank you.
Any other questions or thoughts? Elizabeth, go ahead.
I'm just going to jump in on this previous conversation, because this is, I think, one of the things. Yeah, one of the things that's really exciting about this book and about the conversation that you're beginning to have, right, is this sort of differences and changing in colonialism. And settler colonialism does, from a native studies perspective, it does something very specific in saying that there's a couple of core processes at work here, one of which is that as opposed to exploiting a population that continues to live on the land, the intention here is to get rid of this population culturally, physically, whatever, and then critically to found something new. And the founding something new is actually where I think your work is really exciting, is because in your chapters on the West, right, this is really clear where there's this intention to replace, to erase this old thing, to found, to, you know, create this new society. I think increasingly within settler colonial studies, there's a use of the term arrivant to talk about other kinds of people who arrive in settler colonial countries in marginalized positions. And so while they're participating in these settler colonial structures, there's a different kind of context in which these people, right, are not expecting to found something wholly new and overwrite, but are subject to the other kinds of discrimination and systems that already exist there. And so, I mean, I think, Professor Koffman, I think what's really exciting about your work, and in listening to you answer Hasia's question, it struck me that if you went later in time, right, this is always the thing, well, what if you took this a while later and we looked at the move of indigenous people to urban areas? I'm speculating here, but I think you could end up with a really interesting sort of next portion of this story, where if we're looking at discrimination and prejudice in dense urban areas, you know, some of this looks very different than the way that you've laid out some of this, you know, 19th and early 20th century series of encounters that looks more like series of, and so, yeah, I mean, maybe this has inspired you to respond. I guess this is more of a rambling comment than a proper question, but I think that your sort of parsing of the discrimination and these overlaps is really productive.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd certainly be, you know, interested in seeing, doing, reading, maybe better, right? You know, some of the late 20th century, early 21st century stuff. I did try to do some mapping of what I think's been going on in terms of indigenous Jewish encounters in Canada in the last 20 years. So it's a slightly more sociological, just to kind of get a handle on this. When I brainstormed working on this subject, I didn't imagine that it would be relevant, frankly, and that's the kind of embarrassment of how little I knew what I was about to embark on. But it turns out to have been, you know, quite a relevant kind of study, and especially in Canada, where I now live and where I grew up, the, you know, discussion around reconciliation and about First Nations and other Indigenous encounters with the Canadian state and with other immigrant communities is really something that, you know, takes the center stage of the public discourse about race in Canada in the way that blacks and whites language, you know, black and white language does in the United States at this moment. So I think 20th century material is incredibly rich, both in terms of how this story of kind of close quarters advocacy, you know, when it happens, when it breaks down, but also about the two major complications of late 20th century Jewish life. I mean, if urbanization is one from the indigenous perspective, the ones from Jewish history perspective, of course, the Holocaust and the state of Israel, both of which, as it turns out, have really significant levels of interest in the world of Native American leadership and scholars and, you know, political activism and art and culture and all the rest of it. So there's some very interesting material to be mined from a cultural perspective and from an organizational perspective and many other things. Incidentally, one additional direction that I think could be taken with the material that would be comparative work. So I've started a little bit of thinking about that, but the differences between Canada and the United States, although most of my conclusions have been that this is kind of a continental process, and while some of the policy issues and differ, there's really probably more similarity to what happens on either side of the border than differences. But if there were similar kinds of studies undertaken in New Zealand or in Central America or in South Africa, I think there's all kinds of really fascinating stories to be told, not just because there are indigenous communities in lots of these places, but because Jews migrate to them. And of course, are early movers. They have similar kinds of economic positions and take similar kinds of roles in power structures very quickly. They don't, so I think that would be another dimension that would be pretty interesting to see.
So I want to throw in one more question. So David, this has to do, in a sense, this is an opportunity for the students from my class who happen to be here. Because one of the issues we discussed that came out of your book was the fact that the these Jews who you're discussing, particularly in the early part, have no missionary impulse, and that they're not interested at all in converting the native peoples to their religion, and that gives them a different kind of stance than the other white people, who, that is the Christians, who are coming there, who to some degree encounter through the aegis of religious, even missionary work, perhaps service through missionary work. Jews don't do that. And how do you see that? So we talked about that in class, and I said, I can't channel the author. So you are here.
Well, so yeah, I mean, I think it's like a good observation to make. The absence of something is an important thing to observe, and the absence of missionizing is one of the key differences. I get asked this question a lot. What's the difference between the Jewish encounter with Native American, other white people? And so this absence is one important one. Another one that I'll flag but not deal with right now is about the absence of sexualization of Native American women, which, I was surprised reading material that, just surprised to notice that how little discussion there is in the Jewish sources, little sort of metaphors of sexual conquest, as there is in so much of the broader white literature in this period. Can you guys hear my kids screaming downstairs? Should I close this door? I can't. So religion is an interesting category, and probably something that I think more could probably be done with. The absence of missionizing is significant on our kind of on the ground experience, and a couple of questions arise from that. One would be a proper dialogue question. If this book was a proper dialogue study, it would not be, it would not be just about sort of how Jews encounter Native America, but how Native Americans encounter Jews. And that's not the book that I wrote, and it's not the talk that I gave. I was not capable of me to do that, although I would have liked to. It feels like it's the sharpest critique of the work. But I would like to know and see better, how specific different Native American groups understood Jewish difference or understood Jews to be Jews. They were not missionizing. Probably were trying to understand the extent to which Jews were trustworthy in business, and perhaps had some categories for understanding their religion, although they probably learned something about Jews from Christian missionaries, and that might have conditioned some of their interactions and their interpretations of Jewish behavior as well. For the most part, religion doesn't play that big of a role. The Jews in this book are not really understood in religious terms, except for in this kind of key story that I just start with, but don't really deal with in that much detail, about the Lost Tribes claim, the claim that American Indians descended somehow from the Lost Tribes of Israel, which basically meant that made Indians and Jews related in the ancient past and considered to share some kind of identity in the present. And this was something that that I was interested to find that a good number of Jewish religious leaders were actually quite excited about. There were certainly some who distanced themselves from the claim, but it survived and was circulated through Jewish newspapers and in sermons, and Jewish leaders, rabbis, got kind of excited about the religious implications of this. And the kind of short version of it is that they understood, if indeed Indians had descended from the lost tribes, then America was a kind of it was the place at the end of exile. It had a significant settlement here had a significant cosmic implication, in that insofar as the ingathering of the exiles was, an important step in the bringing about the coming of the redemption. And so there was, there was a religious dimension to, to all of the other things that they celebrated about settlement. The one other detail about denominationalism I think is really important is that after the Dawes Severalty Act, the I think it's about early 70s, the American federal government moved Indian affairs from the Department of War into the hands of specific Christian denominations. And there was a debate in Congress for a short time about whether or not Jews should be given part of the, should be apportioned some portion of the responsibility of administering Indian affairs, which they decided not to do. And it was kind of a short conversation, but this is kind of, and again, a kind of significant difference, and it's based on this difference of the lack of missionary impulse.
Other questions or thoughts? Yeah, I wanted to ask just a question that it's kind of on the margins of historiography. If I understood you correctly, you noted that in the kind of early stage one, there's a lot of kind of narratives of violence and kind of how Jews played a role in the triumphant kind of capturing of land from Native Americans. And then in stage two, it becomes this kind of uplift. So in that kind of mid 20th century conversation, when Jews are beginning to kind of, or some Jews, I should say, if I understood you correctly, are beginning to rethink the way they think about Native Americans. Is there a different kind of way in which the story is told, that early encounter is retold? I'm kind of thinking about like all these 20th century histories of various Jewish communities of X, town in the West or a town in the Midwest. When these books come out in the 40s and 50s, do they kind of sugarcoat the experience, or is this kind of like a completely separate track where you have people in certain sectors of the American kind of liberal establishment doing one thing, and the storytelling, I'd say storytelling / historiography is really doing it in a different sort of way? Do we have any way of mapping that in these circumstances?
Yeah, we do, and the difference is pretty stark. So the conversation that's happening at local historical societies and local Jewish Historical Society journals and amateur history books, or books for young readers or for children that are about the communities of the West, they never see Jewish culpability in Native American displacement. They never turn to it. I'm not even sure it's being turned to now in the local public history, the articulations of local public history. They write about indigenous people. It's called, in the language of firsting. They're there at the beginning, and then they just disappear from the story. And as far as these kind of intellectuals, these lawyers and civil servants and university professors who in the 30s and 40s and 50s are thinking about Native American life, they are, though they may be interested in Jews and in some of the contemporary race problems that Jews are up against in America, and though they are also interested in the, in redress of America's colonial sins, they never put the two together either. So even these guys, they don't talk about the Jews as colonists, their own history. They don't write their own people's history into, the kind of ugly part of participation. So this is, I think that's, I just don't have many examples. Whenever the liberals or newspaper editors or people who do want to call out the state and talk about the consequences of American imperialism, they're talking about the state. They don't talk about their own ancestors. And so it's yeah, I think that's pretty clear. I would be certainly interested if anyone ever found any good evidence from this period to the contrary, but I couldn't find any. And so I think that's a stark answer.
Bob, go ahead.
First of all, David, great to see you.
Nice to see you too.
Hear about your work. Just an observation on a point you made just a few minutes ago about exploring the Native American reaction to Jews. As you were saying that, it occurred to me that would be fabulous in the sense that, correct me if I'm wrong, but that the Native American population was not heir to this long and rich history that was so negative about Jews, Jewish limited economic activities, Jewish hostility to the reigning culture. These are people who, hadn't grown up with the Merchant of Venice, and to see what more of a blank slate in encountering Jews would have produced, I think would be absolutely fascinating.
Well, I agree, it'd be great. Unfortunately, I can't draw that many conclusions about it because I don't have much evidence, but I would say that it probably wasn't entirely a blank slate. First of all, what influence, what sort of understanding of Jews, at least certain Native American communities had, may have been shaped by missionary knowledge. And so while that's not freighted with the same kind of cultural baggage, there may have actually been some of that came too, because there was, in Hasia's book actually about peddlers, deals with some of the local cultural anxiety about the market reaching into new places, and all sorts of local leaders anxious about what the consequences of having more market forces and credit and objects of materialism encroach upon their communities, what they might do to their political organization and to their cultural sensibilities. Some of this stuff may very well have echoed through reservation communities or through other indigenous communities in smaller in towns and stuff like that. So there is a question to ask, and there are research directions to take. Again, I don't know if we're gonna find, but I think it'd be interesting for a host of reasons. Ideally, ones for reasons that might advance some of the interesting questions in Native American studies as well. Some of the bigger preoccupations in that field. I think Jews in this sense are good to think with, and so one of the other I think be helpful dimensions or useful dimensions is and some the way. Well, let me just back up. The way that I think that I see some of this is a kind of triangulation. There's Jews are looking at Native Americans and they're looking at like normative mainstream whites when they're trying to figure out where they fit in. My presumption is that when other communities, minority communities, for lack of a better word, are looking at one another, they're also triangulating and thinking about sort of who's the mainstream and who's not the mainstream, and where do we fit in vis-a-vis these other kinds of minorities. And you can see things, or as it turns out, people do see themselves reflected in new ways when they bring new people to compare themselves to. So, you know, I was at a meeting a couple of years ago. It sounds like the start of a joke, but it's not, with a conservative rabbi and a reform rabbi and an Orthodox Jew, and Dennis Cockfield, who's the former Northwest Territories premier, and he started an organization called Partnership for a New Canada, and it was sort of about Canadian Indigenous relations and sort of better understanding. And you know, everyone around the table, all the Jewish leaders around the table, were telling him about how all the programs that they're doing at their synagogues is really good for the Jews. It's good for the Jews to know something about First Nations in Canada, in part because it helps them see themselves in new ways. This is like a good identity building project. And I think this is an interesting observation, but I also believe that it's a useful thing to think about disaggregating the general category of whites or of settler populations, and to think about the kinds of categories that they use that are organic to themselves. So in Canada, the big project, at least, you know, up until COVID, of course, we'll see what happens after, is in reconciliation. But most Canadians, I think most American whites, don't see themselves as settlers. They don't. It's not a kind of organic term. So I think if there were more studies like this that focused on disaggregating a truly heterogeneous white population, but thought about how those histories intersected with Native American history, if there were Catholic ones and Mormon ones and Italian ones and Portuguese ones, then we might have a much better chance of having people relate to this enterprise of reconciliation, of kind of moving the dial forward in a way that made sense to them. Since for now, the only people that engage with this conversation in a serious way are already converted, you know, are the people who you know, see themselves implicated in it already, and who take positions as descendants of settler ancestors.
Great. Other thoughts or questions? Well, I want to just take another moment to thank you, David, for a really fantastic talk, which clearly set us off on a wonderful discussion, and thank all of you here for participating and for joining us virtually. And thank you again to the Native Studies Forum, Professor Ellis, for your co-sponsorship. And I hope this is, to echo something that Hasia mentioned, I hope this is the beginning of many more collaborations on these topics. And David, you've given us some topics to tackle in future collaborations. So I look forward to seeing many of you again as little boxes on a screen, and then in some not too distant future in person. So thank you all, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. Thank you, David.
Very
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you. Nice to see you all.
Okay, great.